December 27, 1942, Northern Australia. The airfield baked under the late morning sun, heat rising off the pierced steel planking like waves from a furnace. Ground crews moved slowly through the glare, sweat dripping from their necks as they fueled and armed the fighters lined up along the strip. The distant drone of engines echoed off the red dirt like a warning. At the far end of the field, a Lockheed P-38 Lightning sat alone, sleek, predatory, glittering under the sun like polished steel. And beside it stood a pilot who didn't look like the kind of man destined to terrify the Japanese Air Force. Second Lieutenant Richard Bong, 22 years old, quiet, soft-spoken, with a face more suited for a college classroom than a cockpit. He barely looked old enough to shave, let alone fly the fastest fighter the United States had ever built. Mechanics said he smiled too easily. Officers said he broke too many rules. His instructors said he flew like he was born with 2 sets of wings. And yet, every man who'd watched him in the air understood something the paperwork didn't show. Richard Bong was dangerous. He climbed into the twin-boom Lightning with the calm of a man stepping into church. The cockpit canopy slammed shut, trapping the heat inside. Sweat rolled down his spine. He didn't wipe it away. His hands wrapped the controls with familiarity bordering on affection. The P-38 engines roared awake, 2 deep, throaty growls vibrating through the ground, scattering dust across the runway. The airfield crew paused to watch. They didn't talk about it openly yet, but rumors were already forming. The kid flew different. The kid flew like he wasn't afraid of anything. The kid flew like he understood the Lightning better than the men who built it. As he rolled toward the runway, the briefing replayed in his mind. Japanese bombers spotted moving south with fighter escort. They were close enough that by the time the call reached the squadron, every minute mattered. He pushed the throttles forward. The Lightning surged ahead, engines screaming, wheels lifting from the earth with the smooth, effortless grace that always sent electricity through his chest. As the ground fell away, the Pacific sky opened in front of him. Bright, endless, merciless. He climbed fast. Too fast, some would say, faster than any manual recommended. But Bong never cared much for manuals. High above the coast, the humidity thinned, and the Lightning sliced through the air like a blade. Clouds hovered in scattered patches, leaving pockets of clear blue where sunlight hit the canopy in sharp white flashes. Then he saw them. A tight formation of Japanese Betty bombers, silver shapes gliding through the sky like sharks beneath the surface of the ocean. Their escort flew above and behind, sleek Zeros, nimble, deadly, waiting to pounce. A normal pilot would have waited for his wingman. A normal pilot would have followed doctrine. A normal pilot would have kept altitude and chosen the safe approach. Richard Bong was not a normal pilot. He pushed the throttles to the firewalls. The Lightning surged forward, the horizon tilted, and the battle began. The P-38 dove like a falling star, its twin engines howling as the airframe shuddered under the pressure. Bong felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the moment when instinct became sharper than training, when the world narrowed to speed, angles, and the kill. Below him, the Japanese formation held steady. The Betty bombers flew in their usual tight box, machine guns bristling from their glass noses and tail cones. Above them, the Zeros shifted, wings glinting white in the sunlight as they reacted to his attack run. They saw him, but they were too late. Bong didn't attack the escort first, another violation of doctrine. Training manuals drilled it into every pilot. Clear the fighters before you go after the bombers. But Richard Bong had learned something that wasn't in any manual. If you hit the formation fast enough, hard enough, and with no hesitation, you could break their rhythm before the fighters ever got a clean angle. He lined up on the lead bomber. Crosshairs settled. The Lightning trembled. He squeezed the trigger. 4 .50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon spat fire in a deafening burst. The tracer line stitched across the bomber's fuselage and into the engines. One engine erupted into flame, the propeller freezing in place. The bomber lurched sideways, dropping like a crippled bird. Before the debris even finished falling, Bong rolled violently left, yanking the Lightning into another diving run. The Zeros dove after him. He felt the air scream past his canopy. Bullets snapped through the sky just behind his tail, hot sparks of death slicing through blue space. But Bong didn't flinch, didn't level out, didn't give them the fight they wanted. He dove deeper, toward a cloud bank, toward concealment, toward chaos. The altimeter needle spun downward. The Lightning shook. The engines growled like furious animals. Then he vanished into the clouds. For 2 long seconds, everything went white. No sky, no horizon, no enemy. Only the static roar in his headset and the violent pounding of his heart. Then he pulled up. The Lightning burst out below the cloud layer, directly under the bomber formation. No one expected that, not the Japanese, not the American instructors who'd written the rules he ignored, not even the pilots who fought alongside him. Bong leveled out and fired again. His bullet shredded the belly gun of another bomber, ripping through the thin skin of the fuselage. Smoke poured from its midsection. The bomber banked sharply before spiraling downward, leaving a long smear of shadow across the ocean. Now the Zeros were closing, 4 of them descending in a deadly arc. Bong felt the familiar flicker of excitement. Not fear, never fear. Combat focused him in a way nothing else did. The P-38 responded to every twitch of his fingers as if wired directly into his nerves. He threw the Lightning into a climbing spiral, something his instructors told him never to do in combat. The P-38 was too heavy, too wide, too complex for tight vertical maneuvers. But Bong wasn't flying the manual. He was flying the machine. The Zeros overshot. Just slightly. Just enough. He rolled over the top of the spiral and dropped onto the tail of the nearest fighter. Trigger. Flash. Smoke. Pieces of wing broke away. The Zero burst into flame and vanished in a corkscrew of fire. 3 left. He pushed the throttles again, more than was safe, more than the mechanics wanted, more than the Lightning was built to endure. The engines screamed, the cockpit rattled, the control column fought him with every inch. He welcomed it. Another Zero tried to slip behind him, diving with incredible agility. Bong snapped the Lightning into a violent dive, using his weight and speed to break the Zero's turn. A split-second opening. That was all he needed. He fired. The Zero exploded in a flash of white fire. 2 left. Bong pulled back on the stick, hard. The Lightning's wings groaned. Black spots flickered at the edges of his vision as G-forces pressed him into the seat. The world spun, blurred, then snapped back into clarity. And suddenly, he was behind the final pair of Zeros. He lined up again, fired, hit, watched metal peel away like paper. The fighter spiraled into the sea. The last Zero fled. Bong didn't chase it. He climbed back toward the sun, breathing hard, sweat running into his eyes, the horizon glowing gold beneath him. The air was quiet again. The Japanese formation was broken. 3 bombers destroyed, 3 fighters down, the rest scattered. Bong looked at his ammo counters, nearly empty. His fuel dipped lower than he liked. The Lightning trembled from the punishment he had put it through. And yet, he felt calm. He had survived again. He had fought on instinct again. He had broken the rules again. And high above the vast Pacific sky, Richard Bong understood something the Army would soon learn. This war wasn't going to be won by the pilots who followed the manual. It was going to be won by those who rewrote it. Word of the encounter spread across the airfield before Bong even rolled to a stop. Ground crews sprinted toward the P-38 as it taxied in, dust swirling around its landing gear. Mechanics looked over the bullet holes, the scorched paint, the thin curls of smoke still drifting from the gun barrels. Bong climbed down slowly, boots hitting the hot metal of the wing. His flight suit was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead, his breath still unsteady from the fight. But his expression, quiet, reserved, was exactly the same as when he'd taken off. He didn't brag. He didn't pose. He didn't even smile. He just shrugged when someone asked how many he'd gotten. 3, maybe 4, he said softly. Maybe. Everyone else knew exactly what he'd done. And that's when the first problem appeared. He was too good. Good enough that instructors whispered behind closed doors. Good enough that squadron commanders started using words like reckless, uncontrolled, undisciplined. Good enough that some officers began treating him less like a talented pilot and more like a threat to their authority. Because Richard Bong didn't fly the P-38 the way they taught it. He flew it the way it wanted to fly. During training in California, he broke formation constantly, rolling, diving, pulling maneuvers no one had ever attempted. Instructors reprimanded him almost daily. Once he flew so low over a parade ground that he blew laundry off a clothesline and reportedly snapped the flag off a pole. He was grounded, lectured, threatened. Then they put him back in the air because even the strictest officers couldn't ignore the truth. Richard Bong was the kind of pilot wars are built around. But talent wasn't his only secret. Up in the sky, in the thin blue air where death came fast and without warning, Bong discovered something every pilot feared to admit. He wasn't addicted to victory. He was addicted to control. In the P-38, he felt something no classroom could teach, a sense that he could outthink, outrun, outmaneuver anything with wings. Every enemy pilot was a puzzle, every attack run a calculation, every split-second decision a test he was built to pass. He studied Japanese tactics obsessively. He memorized climb rates, turn radii, dive speeds. He knew exactly when a Zero would stall, when a bomber crew would panic, when a rookie pilot would make the fatal mistake of pulling up too soon. And every mission sharpened him. The next weeks became a blur of heat, sweat, and rising tallies. 2 victories, then 3 more, then 6, then 10. Each time, Bong came back the same way. Quiet, humble, almost embarrassed by the attention. His commanders didn't know what to do with him. He broke rules, ignored doctrine, challenged instructors. But he survived again and again in situations where even the best American pilots died. And that made him dangerous. Word of his growing score spread across the Pacific. Some pilots envied him, others idolized him. Many feared that one day he'd simply push the lightning too far and vanish into the sea. But Bong never flew to impress. He flew because something inside him demanded perfection, perfect shots, perfect timing, perfect decisions. And that drive was transforming him into something America had never seen before. A new breed of ace. Not a brawler, not a daredevil, not a showman, but a quiet machine of precision, focus, and cold, unstoppable instinct. By the time his score reached 19 kills, he'd already broken every rule the training manual had ever written. And by the time he reached 25, the Army finally understood what they had on their hands. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This wasn't bravado. Richard Bong was rewriting the American way of aerial combat, one trigger pull at a time. By early 1944, the Pacific skies had begun to whisper a name that traveled farther than any radio call: Bong. Japanese pilots heard it through scattered intelligence reports. American pilots murmured it in tented briefings before dawn. Commanders spoke it with a mix of pride and something close to fear. Because by then, Richard Bong wasn't just an ace. He was a problem the Army had never prepared for. He flew too well. He survived too often. He racked up victories so fast that his superiors struggled to maintain the illusion that the training pipeline, the one they'd spent years refining, was working exactly as planned. It wasn't. Bong didn't follow the system. He broke it, and the results were undeniable. Every time he took off, something happened, something the Army could neither predict nor explain. His instincts sharpened to a razor's edge. His understanding of the P-38 became something uncanny. His patience in combat, cold surgical, outclassed every doctrine taught in American classrooms. But the war had a way of testing even the best. On one blistering afternoon over New Guinea, Bong found himself trapped above a narrow valley. The air shimmered from heat, distorting the jungle canopy into a trembling mosaic of green. His lightning was running hot, too hot. Coolant needles crept into the red, warning lights flickered, and the throttles fought him with every push. Below him, a swarm of Zeros circled like wolves scenting a wounded deer. He had climbed too hard, stayed too long, burned too much fuel. And for the first time in a long time, he felt trapped. The Zeros made the sky shrink around him, tightening the noose, slipping closer with every turn. At that altitude, he couldn't outrun them, couldn't climb, couldn't dive without risking a stall. And then, through the sweat stinging his eyes, he saw the one escape route the Japanese couldn't anticipate, straight through the middle of their formation. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was exactly the kind of maneuver Richard Bong would choose. He pushed both throttles forward. The lightning growled, trembling under the strain. The cockpit filled with heat like an oven door had swung open. The propellers bit into the air with furious speed. The Zeros tightened their circle, too confident, too slow. Bong dove directly at them. The formation fractured in panic. 2 Zeros broke left, 1 peeled upward, another froze for half a second too long. Bong lined up the shot, squeezed the trigger. A burst of cannon fire tore through the Zero's fuselage, flames blooming from the engine. The explosion lit the sky. Then he used the blast wave itself, to snap the P-38 into a rolling dive, dropping into the valley so low the lightning's wingtips sliced through, rising thermals, like a knife through steam. For 30 terrifying seconds, he skimmed the treetops, Zeros screaming behind him, tracer rounds cutting through the hot air like sparks from a forge. But the P-38 was built for speed, and Bong knew exactly when to unleash it. He leveled out, throttles wide open, letting the twin engines drag him forward in a straight-line escape. The jungle blurred, the sky widened, the gunfire faded. And then, silence. He was alone again. The Zeros weren't just outmaneuvered, they were humiliated. When Bong landed, the ground crew stared at the bullet holes, the scorch marks, the trembling engines that looked ready to collapse. They expected him to be shaken. Instead, Bong climbed down calmly, wiped sweat from his forehead, and said only, "She brought me back." As if he hadn't just escaped death by inches, as if he hadn't outflown an entire formation, as if he hadn't performed a maneuver that violated every lesson the Army had drilled into its pilots. His commanders didn't know whether to ground him or promote him, and the legend only grew. 30 kills, then 35. Each one a textbook study in impossible precision. Newspaper clippings reached the front. Posters, radio mentions. America was desperate for heroes, and Bong fit perfectly, quiet, deadly, a symbol of skill triumphing over chaos. But Bong felt something else creeping in beneath the fame. Exhaustion, responsibility, the weight of surviving when others didn't. Every night he sat in the dim glow of the tent lamps, listening to the jungle insects buzz like static, wondering how many more fights he had left in him. He folded letters from home carefully, like they were made of glass. He wrote replies methodically, each word chosen with caution. Because the more victories he earned, the more he realized something no one teaches in training. For an ace, the most dangerous enemy isn't the one in the sky. It's the expectation that he will always return. Richard Bong had become more than a pilot, more than an ace, more than a hero. He had become a symbol the Army couldn't afford to lose. And a man who wasn't sure how much longer fate would stay on his side. By mid-1944, the weight of Bong's reputation began shaping every decision the Army made about him. Each kill added another layer of expectation. Each mission felt heavier than the last. Each newspaper back home made him less a man and more a myth. 40 victories. A number no American had ever reached. A number that terrified Army leadership as much as it impressed them. Because with every Zero he shot down, the same question echoed through headquarters. How long until he doesn't come back? They had seen it happen to other aces, men chasing their own legends, flying too aggressively, pushing too far, until the law of averages finally caught them. Even the greatest pilots eventually met a bullet with their name on it. Bong wasn't reckless, but he was extraordinary, and extraordinary pilots attract extraordinary danger. One morning, after a mission briefing, his commanding officer pulled him aside. The airfield buzzed with heat, engines warming, propellers idling like impatient beasts. But the CO's voice was quiet, almost pained. "You've done enough, Dick." Those words hung in the air heavier than any metal. Bong frowned, unsure he'd heard correctly. Done enough? While the war still raged? While men younger than him bled and died over the Pacific? The CO continued. "Headquarters wants you grounded, permanently. They're assigning you stateside. You're too valuable to lose." Too valuable to lose? A strange kind of compliment, and a sentence. Bong didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his way. He just stood there in silence while aircraft roared around him, the war continuing without pause. Deep inside, anger flickered. Not pride. Anger. Because for the first time in his life, he felt something worse than fear. Helplessness. He had survived dogfights that shredded metal. He had outflown pilots who trained their entire lives. He had mastered a machine so powerful it sometimes frightened its own mechanics. And now he was being told to stop, not because he failed, but because he succeeded too well. Word spread quickly. Pilots approached him with awkward smiles, handshakes, pats on the shoulder. Some congratulated him, others envied him. A few looked at him the way soldiers look at someone walking off the battlefield while they stay behind. And Bong hated that feeling. The next morning, with orders in hand, he walked across the airfield for what he assumed would be the last time. The sun had barely risen. Dew clung to the metal skins of the fighters, shimmering like sweat before a fight. Mechanics saluted him quietly. Pilots nodded. Ground crews murmured his name like a farewell. He paused beside his P-38, the twin-engine Predator that had carried him through more death than any man deserved to survive. He ran a hand along the nose, felt the cold metal, felt the scratches left by tools and shrapnel, felt the bond between man and machine that could never be explained to anyone who hadn't flown at the edge of life. Then he stepped back, because the war no longer belonged to him. He was being sent home to train others, to teach young pilots how to do what he did, to pass on instincts no manual could capture, to become the system he once defied. But he knew, even then, that something had changed inside him, something darker, quieter, heavier. He wasn't sure who he was without the sky, without the adrenaline, without the twin engines screaming on either side of his cockpit. He was 23 years old, America's greatest ace, a legend forged in Pacific heat. And he had absolutely no idea what the rest of his life was supposed to look like. When Bong returned to the United States, the contrast hit him harder than any zero ever could. 1 month earlier, he had been skimming treetops in New Guinea, with bullets slicing past his canopy. Now he was shaking hands with politicians who had never heard a gunshot in their lives. Reporters crowded around him, flashing cameras in his face, shouting questions he didn't know how to answer. How does it feel to be America's top ace? What's your secret? Are you fearless? Will you write a book? Fearless. If only they understood. The fear never went away. He simply learned to fly with it. But no one wanted that truth. They wanted a poster boy, a clean, smiling, perfect American hero who made victory look effortless. Crowds lined up to see him. Newspapers printed his face on the front page. The Army paraded him like a trophy. And Richard Bong felt utterly, completely out of place. He missed the sky. Not the killing, never the killing, but the clarity of purpose, the silence between maneuvers, the certainty that every breath mattered. In America, nothing mattered. Everything felt muted, distant, hollow. He was awarded the Medal of Honor by General Douglas MacArthur himself. Cameras flashed. Applause thundered. Bong stood at attention, uniform perfectly pressed, while the medal's ribbon rested against his chest. But in the photos taken that day, if you look closely, his eyes tell a different story. He was already somewhere else, somewhere above the Pacific, somewhere inside a cockpit vibrating with power, engines screaming, hands steady on the controls. Glory had never been the point. He wanted to serve. He wanted to fly. He wanted to protect the men still fighting, but the Army wouldn't let him go back. He was too famous, too symbolic, too important to risk. Instead, they stationed him stateside as a test pilot, a role he accepted because he had no choice, but one that slowly began to unravel him. The P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, was a different beast entirely. Smooth, fast, unpredictable, a machine from the future. It fascinated him. It terrified him. It tempted him in ways no prop-driven fighter ever had. He threw himself into testing with quiet intensity, studied every schematic, memorized every control, listened to the turbine whine with a mixture of awe and unease. But something was missing. A test flight wasn't combat. A test pilot wasn't at war. And Bong, for all his skill, had never learned how to live without danger pressing against his ribs. He smiled for the cameras, shook hands at public events, signed autographs for wide-eyed boys who dreamed of becoming pilots. But at night, alone in his quarters, he sat in the dark with a heaviness that no metal could lift. He was 24 years old and already carried the weariness of a man twice his age. The nation saw a hero. His peers saw a legend. Recruiters saw a symbol. But behind all of that, Richard Bong felt something he had never felt in the Pacific skies. He felt lost. The war had taken from him, not just comrades, not just innocence, but purpose. And purpose is the one thing a fighter pilot cannot live without. In the months that followed, Bong lived between two worlds, one anchored to American soil, the other still drifting over the Pacific, where pieces of him remained suspended in the humid air above jungles and ocean. Every morning he walked into the test hangars, rows of silver aircraft gleaming under fluorescent lights. The P-80 Shooting Star waited for him like a riddle wrapped in polished metal. It was sleek and beautiful, the cutting edge of American aviation, with a jet engine that shrieked like something alive. It was faster than anything he'd ever flown, climbed harder, turned sharper, punished mistakes with no mercy. There were no slow spins, no forgiving dives, no second chances. A piston engine sputtered before it died. A jet simply stopped. Bong studied everything: fuel flow charts, compressor dynamics, stall characteristics. But testing was its own kind of war, where the enemy was physics and the battlefield was the thin space between innovation and disaster. He had flown through tracer fire, escaped swarms of Zeros, survived impossible odds. But this was different. In combat, he trusted his instincts. In the P-80, instincts weren't enough. His fellow test pilots admired him, but privately they wondered how long a man built for dogfights could live in this new era where battles were fought in equations, not maneuvers. Some nights the hangar stayed lit until long after midnight. Bong would sit inside the cockpit of the Shooting Star, canopy open, hands resting on the controls, eyes closed. Mechanics passed by quietly, recognizing the posture, not meditation, but longing. He wanted to feel at home in this machine, wanted to command it the way he'd commanded the Lightning, wanted to belong to the sky again. But the truth gnawed at him. The sky he belonged to no longer existed. The war had moved on. The world had moved on. And Bong was a relic of a kind of flying that was already dying. Yet he kept pushing. Because beneath the calm smile, beneath the soft voice, beneath the polite replies to reporters and officers, lived the same thing that had carried him through 40 aerial victories, an inability to quit. And so he flew, day after day, sorting out stall behaviors, testing limits, climbing into thin air where the jet engine's scream drowned his thoughts. But the pressure mounted, expectations, eyes watching him, whispers that if America's top ace could master the jet, the nation would have its next leap forward. He carried the weight of a symbol he'd never asked to be. And behind that symbol was a young man drained by fame, scraped hollow by war, and desperately trying to prove he wasn't just a legend of the past. On August mornings, the California sun beat down on the tarmac, heat radiating from the concrete in shimmering waves. The P-80 sat at the end of the runway, nose pointed toward a future Bong was trying to catch. Technicians checked the fuel lines. Ground crew tightened bolts and wiped oil from the cowling. Bong performed his walk-around in silence, touching each control surface with a deliberate, almost tender familiarity. This was supposed to be a simple acceptance flight, a demonstration for officials, a formality, a routine test for a man who had lived through far worse. But nothing about Bong's life had ever been routine. He climbed into the cockpit, closed the canopy, strapped in. The turbine whined to life, building into a roar that vibrated through the air. For a moment, he sat still, breathing in the smell of metal and fuel, feeling the heat of the engine behind him, hearing the world fade into a low, steady hum. The California sky stretched endlessly ahead. It should have felt like home. But something inside him whispered a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. He was no longer the man who had mastered the P-38. He was a man trying to outrun the shadow of his own legend. He pushed the throttle forward, and the jet leapt down the runway like a creature freed from a cage. The P-80 climbed fast, slicing through the California sky in a clean, perfect arc. From the ground, officers shaded their eyes, tracking the silver streak as it rose higher and higher, sunlight glinting off its wings like a flare. It looked smooth, controlled, effortless, exactly what they expected from Richard Bong. Inside the cockpit, the world narrowed to vibration and heat. The jet engine howled behind him, a sound unlike any piston roar he'd ever known. Raw power, hungry power, a force that demanded respect with every second it ran. Bong leveled off, ran the checklist, began the acceptance sequence. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Then, a flicker. A single needle on the panel twitched. Fuel pressure, just a hiccup, barely noticeable. Then a second flicker, then a drop. A sudden, sharp, catastrophic drop. Bong's eyes snapped to the gauge. He adjusted mixture, adjusted throttle. No response. The engine surged, then coughed, then went silent. At 600 feet, a jet without power isn't a glider. It's a stone. The P-80 dipped, nose tilting toward the ground. Bong fought the controls, trying to coax lift from a machine that no longer had breath. The runway flashed beneath him. Hangars rushed upward. The airframe shuddered violently. There was no altitude, no time, no second chance. Witnesses on the ground saw the jet drop like its wings had been severed. For an instant, it seemed to level, just enough to clear a building, before the left wing clipped a utility pole. The world erupted. A fireball swallowed the aircraft, rolling black smoke into the sky. Pieces of the fuselage tumbled across the pavement, skidding, burning, dissolving into twisted scraps of metal. Men sprinted toward the wreckage. Heat forced them back. Flames roared. Fuel cracked and hissed. There was nothing anyone could do. America's greatest ace died on the same day the country celebrated its newest military achievement, the successful test of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. August 6, 1945. While the world shouted victory, the man who had fought the air war with unmatched precision burned in silence on a California runway. Richard Bong was 24. He never flew in combat again, never wrote a book, never gave the speeches the Army planned, never lived to see the world he helped secure. But his legacy, the quiet man with the steady hands, the rule breaker who changed aerial warfare, the farm boy from Wisconsin who outflew the best of Japan, endured long after the smoke cleared. 40 victories, 40 lives saved on his side, countless others protected, and all achieved without ever boasting, without ever chasing fame, without ever forgetting that the sky gives nothing freely. Today, his medal sits in a museum. His P-38 hangs from a ceiling. His face appears in grainy photographs, smiling softly, almost shyly, a boy who never looked like the killer he became. But the pilots who studied him, the men who survived because he cleared the sky, the nation that still speaks his name, they know the truth. Richard Bong didn't dominate the war because he followed the system. He dominated the war because he wasn't afraid to break it. And somewhere high above, in the quiet blue where engines echo like memory, his lightning still flies, sharp, fast, steady, carrying the ghost of the greatest ace America ever had.